A woman sits alone in her apartment, staring at a framed photograph of her mother, and she feels absolutely nothing. Not hatred, not grief, not longing. Just a vast, quiet emptiness where a hurricane of emotion used to live. Her phone buzzes with messages from relatives calling her cold, broken, heartless for going no contact. She reads them, places the phone face down, and returns to her silence. This is the moment most people mistake for a breakdown, but Carl Jung recognized it as something far more rare and terrifying: the emergence of the individuated empath. The therapist across from her waits for the tears, the guilt, the familiar collapse into people-pleasing. Instead, the woman speaks with a voice that sounds almost foreign to her own ears. She says, "I don't miss them. I miss who I thought they were." Jung spent decades tracking this exact psychological shift, and what he discovered made him revise his entire understanding of human sensitivity. These weren't people healing in the conventional sense. They were people becoming something that psychology had no name for, something that terrifies the unawakened while liberating the one undergoing the change. Today, we're tracing the actual trajectory of the awakened empath according to Jung's clinical observations, and I'm warning you now, it looks nothing like the Instagram spirituality version. To grasp where this transformation leads, we must first understand the architecture of the unawakened empath. And Jung refused to sentimentalize this figure. He saw the empath not as a mystical being, but as a psychological survivalist. Their sensitivity wasn't a gift descending from the cosmos. It was a radar system installed by a childhood where emotional prediction meant emotional survival. The empath's gift is often just a wound that learned to read minds. The toddler who learned to read the stagger in Father's Walk. The adolescent who monitored the silence before the explosion. The adult who walks into any room and instantly knows who's carrying unspoken grief, who's performing happiness, who's about to shatter. These individuals didn't cultivate empathy through meditation retreats or spiritual seeking. Their nervous systems were forged in environments where not knowing what everyone else felt meant getting hurt. Jung called this archetype the wounded healer for a reason. The wound came first, and the healing others came as an adaptation to never being healed themselves. Their attention turned outward because no one ever turned inward toward them. They became cartographers of other people's emotional terrain because their own inner landscape was treated as irrelevant. The culture calls this a superpower. Jung called it a scar with sophisticated coping mechanisms. And here's where the spiritual marketplace cashes in on the confusion. It tells empaths their sensitivity proves they're chosen, ancient, evolved, that their inability to filter others' emotions is evidence of spiritual advancement. This narrative hits like morphine on a broken bone. Finally, the pain means something beautiful. But Jung would identify this belief as the primary obstacle to genuine awakening. Because as long as you're worshiping the wound, you'll never examine why it exists. The awakened empath doesn't start by embracing their sensitivity. They start by interrogating its origins. They ask questions that make spiritual circles uncomfortable. Why do I feel responsible for managing everyone's emotional state? What happened in my development that wired my nervous system to prioritize others' comfort over my own survival? When did I internalize the belief that my worth depends on how much I can absorb without complaint? These aren't spiritual inquiries. They're psychological excavations, and they lead somewhere the empath as divine being narrative cannot survive. Jung observed that authentic empathic awakening always begins with a period of disillusionment, so complete it mimics clinical depression. The empath starts seeing their relationships with terrifying clarity, and the vision devastates them. Not because everyone around them is malicious, but because the entire relational architecture they've inhabited for decades was built on a foundation of self-erasure so total that nothing authentic remains standing. They realize they've been performing a script, the understanding one, the forgiving one, the one who never tires, the one who translates cruelty into compassion, the one who makes themselves small so others can feel big. And they realize this performance wasn't love. It wasn't spiritual maturity. It was a trauma response so deeply woven into their identity that they couldn't distinguish it from their soul. This recognition is where most empaths turn back, because what comes next is unbearable for someone whose entire sense of self was built on being indispensable. What comes next is the death of the caretaker. And Jung documented this death with the rigor of someone who understood that psychological rebirth requires a prior death. The caretaker dies when the empath finally accepts a truth they've spent their life fleeing. They cannot rescue anyone. Not through their sensitivity, not through their understanding, not through their willingness to carry what others won't. All those years of absorbing other people's darkness didn't transform that darkness. It simply transferred it into the empath's own body, their own nervous system, their own chronic fatigue and unexplained illnesses and the depression that made no sense because their external life looked functional. Jung termed this shadow integration, and for empaths specifically, it meant integrating the shadow of their compassion. Because compassion casts a shadow. The shadow of perpetual helping is the addiction to being needed. The shadow of endless forgiveness is the incapacity to hold others accountable. The shadow of absorbing everyone's pain is the evasion of facing your own. And until the empath confronts these shadows, their sensitivity remains a prison disguised as a gift. What emerges when the caretaker dies? This is where Jung's observations become genuinely unsettling, because the person who walks through doesn't resemble what anyone anticipated. They don't become a more polished, more compassionate, more radiant version of their former self. They become someone the former self would have feared. Before we continue, if you're ready to map your own journey from unconscious sensitivity to conscious wholeness, our new guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Jung's framework. Click the link below to begin the work of finding yourself within. The first characteristic of the awakened empath is impenetrable selectivity, not occasional discernment, absolute, non-negotiable sovereignty over who accesses their energy, their time, their emotional presence. The unawakened empath was available to everyone. The awakened empath is available to almost no one. And this isn't bitterness or walls or avoidance. It's the natural outcome of someone who finally comprehends the value of their attention and refuses to spend it on those who deplete it. Jung described this as psychological sovereignty. The empath has reclaimed the territory of their own psyche. They're no longer public land anyone can occupy. They're private property, and entry requires demonstrated respect for what grows inside. This looks cold to those who benefited from the old availability. But Jung recognized it as the first authentic sign of psychological health. The empath has stopped conflating self-sacrifice with love. The second quality the awakened empath develops is the capacity to be uncomfortable to be around. They gain the ability to speak truths that disrupt others' comfort, to hold people accountable without softening reality into something digestible, to sit in someone else's displeasure without rushing to resolve it. The unawakened empath would have absorbed the tension, apologized, smoothed everything over. The awakened empath allows the tension to remain because they've learned that premature resolution is just another form of prioritizing others' comfort over their own integrity. Jung found this development fascinating because it emerges from integrating what he called the aggressive shadow. Empaths typically repress all aggression, all fierceness, all confrontational capacity. They've internalized that these qualities contradict empathy. But Jung understood that someone who cannot access their aggression isn't peaceful, they're domesticated. There's a profound difference between choosing gentleness and being incapable of anything else. The awakened empath can be gentle. They can also be fierce. And the choice between them is conscious, deliberate, and appropriate to the situation. The third transformation is perhaps the most disturbing to witness from outside. The awakened empath develops what Jung called detached perception. They can perceive someone suffering with absolute clarity and choose not to engage. Not because they've stopped feeling, but because they've learned to distinguish between recognizing pain and being responsible for it. The unawakened empath couldn't make this distinction. Another's pain was automatically their assignment. The awakened empath perceives the same pain and recognizes it as belonging to the person experiencing it. They can hold compassion without holding responsibility. And this capacity terrifies those accustomed to the empath carrying everything. Jung emphasized that detached perception wasn't the absence of empathy. It was empathy matured beyond codependency. The empath still feels deeply. They still perceive what others miss. They still carry that extraordinary sensitivity their childhood forged into them. But the feeling no longer controls their behavior. They can feel someone's desperation without being manipulated by it. They can sense someone's loneliness without making it their project to fix. They hold the full weight of what they perceive, and then they make a conscious choice about whether and how to respond. The fourth thing, the awakened empath becomes is comfortable with being misperceived. This may sound minor, but Jung considered it one of the most significant markers of genuine individuation. The unawakened empath was terrified of being misperceived. They would explain endlessly, contort their communication, anticipate every possible misinterpretation, and try to prevent it. Their terror of being seen as selfish or cold drove them to perform constant emotional availability even when running on empty. The awakened empath allows others to misperceive them. They state their truth once. They don't chase understanding. They don't over-explain, justify, or defend. If someone interprets their boundaries as cruelty, the awakened empath can tolerate that interpretation without crumbling. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. Recognizing that you cannot control how others see you, and that the desperate need to manage everyone's perception is itself a form of imprisonment. This doesn't mean the awakened empath is indifferent to connection. They crave authentic relationship more deeply than ever. But they've learned that authentic relationship is only possible with people who can see them clearly without the empath having to engineer that seeing. Let them misunderstand you. The right ones won't need a translation. The fifth transformation Jung documented was the most paradoxical. The awakened empath becomes genuinely dangerous. Not violent, not cruel. Dangerous in the way that anyone who sees clearly is always dangerous to systems built on illusion. They can detect manipulation the moment it begins. They can identify narcissistic patterns in a single exchange. They can sense when someone's words and energy contradict, and they trust that sensing absolutely without needing external validation. Jung observed that this perceptual accuracy, combined with the willingness to act on it, made awakened empaths threatening to unhealthy systems. Families organized around secrets. Organizations structured around dysfunction. Relationships built on control. The unawakened empath was the perfect participant in these systems because they would absorb the toxicity and keep everything functioning. The awakened empath sees the toxicity, names it if necessary, and removes themselves entirely if nothing changes. They've become the person the dysfunctional system cannot afford in the room because their clarity exposes what everyone else has agreed to ignore. But here's the cost Jung documented with unflinching honesty. The person the awakened empath becomes is lonely in ways the unawakened empath never was. The unawakened empath was exhausted, depleted, used, but they were surrounded. They had a role, a purpose, an identity others affirmed. The awakened empath has shed all of that. They've released the relationships that fed on their availability. They've abandoned the role that gave them identity. They've stopped performing the version of themselves that everyone loved. And what remains is a person who is psychologically whole, but socially smaller. Fewer people, fewer obligations, fewer connections. Each one genuine, but the quantity has dropped dramatically. Jung didn't romanticize this. He acknowledged that the transition period, the space between the death of the old self and the stabilization of the new one, was among the most painful psychological experiences a human can endure. You've released everything familiar. You haven't yet built what comes next. You're standing in open territory with nothing around you. And the freedom everyone talks about in spiritual awakening feels less like liberation and more like exile. This is why Jung was so critical of the spiritual marketplace's version of empathic awakening. They sell it as a beautiful metamorphosis. But Jung saw something raw. He saw people grieving the loss of their own identity, mourning relationships that had been the architecture of their entire existence, sitting with the devastating recognition that much of what they called love was actually just their trauma response, making them useful to people who couldn't meet their own emotional needs. And yet Jung found that those who survived this transformation, who made it through the grief and the loneliness and the terrifying open space of having no one to rescue, emerged into something that looked like quiet power. Not the dramatic, visible power the world recognizes. Not charisma or influence or authority. Something subtler and more resilient. The power of someone who knows exactly who they are, what they will accept, and what they won't. Someone who has stopped negotiating with their own boundaries. Who has stopped apologizing for their own existence. who has stopped contorting themselves into whatever shape would make everyone else comfortable. Jung called this the individuated empath, someone who completed the journey from unconscious sensitivity to conscious perception, from compulsive absorption to deliberate choice, from performing empathy for survival to embodying empathy as strength. The individuated empath feels everything. They still possess that extraordinary perceptual capacity their childhood burned into their nervous system, but it serves them now instead of consuming them. It informs their choices instead of dictating their behavior. It connects them to people who deserve connection instead of chaining them to people who exploit it. The uncomfortable truth is that most people prefer the old empath, the available one, the one who would sit with your pain for hours without complaint, the one who would forgive anything because holding you accountable felt like cruelty, the one who would sacrifice their own well-being to maintain yours. That empath was convenient, useful, easy to be around because they demanded nothing while giving everything. The awakened empath demands reciprocity. They require honesty. They insist on being treated with the same care they offer others. And for those accustomed to the old dynamic, these requirements feel like betrayal. They'll say the empath has changed, become selfish, lost their compassion. Jung heard these accusations from the families and partners of his patients who were individuating, and he recognized them for what they were. Not descriptions of the empath's decline, but descriptions of other people's loss of access to an unregulated resource they had been exploiting without awareness. If you're in this transformation right now, if you're in the terrifying space between who you were and who you're becoming, Jung would want you to know something. The discomfort you feel isn't a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's a sign that you're doing it at all. The loneliness isn't evidence of failure. It's the natural consequence of outgrowing a life built to contain someone who no longer exists. The grief is real and appropriate because you are losing something. You're losing the person everyone was comfortable with. And that loss creates space for the person you actually are. What the awakened empath becomes isn't prettier or more spiritual or more enlightened than who they were before. They become real, imperfect and boundaried, and sometimes difficult and always honest. They become someone who can feel everything without being destroyed by it, who can perceive everything without being obligated to fix it, who can love deeply without losing themselves inside that love. Jung believed this transformation was one of the most significant a human consciousness could undergo, not because empaths are special or chosen, but because the journey from unconscious sensitivity to conscious wholeness requires confronting every comfortable lie you've ever told yourself about who you are and why you do what you do. It requires dying to an identity that felt like home, even though it was a prison. It requires standing in the empty space after everything falls away and discovering that you're still there, that you've always been there. Underneath the performing, the absorbing, the rescuing, the accommodating, underneath all of it, there was always a person. And that person is finally allowed to exist. That's what the awakened empath becomes. Not a better version of the old self. A completely different relationship with the self. One where sensitivity is a tool rather than a wound. Where perception is a choice rather than a compulsion. Where love is an offering rather than an obligation. That's the uncomfortable truth. And if you're living it right now, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts, you're further along than you think. If this reflection resonated with your own journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Winds of Thought for more explorations into the depths of psychological transformation. And if you're ready to go deeper, our guide True Self-Discovery is waiting for you with 24 practical exercises to help you navigate your own awakening. Click the link below to begin.